The wind carried a chill that cut through the pines like a blade, and the sun had just begun to slip behind the jagged peaks, painting the horizon in streaks of blood and gold. He had inherited the cabin under strange circumstances, a relic of a family line, long thought lost to the wilderness. It sat on the edge of a ridge, where the forest dropped sharply into shadowed valleys, untouched by time and forgotten by men. The cabin smelled of aged timber and the faint trace of smoke from years gone by. And standing at its threshold, he felt the weight of history pressing against his chest. Every board creaked beneath his boots as though whispering secrets he was not yet ready to hear. He hadn't expected anyone to be there. The wilderness was supposed to be silent, broken only by the call of hawks and the rustle of leaves. Yet, as he stepped closer to the porch, the scent of wildflowers and wood smoke mixed with something else, something unsettling and alive. And then he saw them. 5 women, standing in a line as if they had been waiting for him since the day the cabin had been built. Their eyes glinted in the fading light, strong and sharp, carrying the kind of confidence that unsettles a man who thought himself prepared. They were beautiful, yes, but there was something more, a challenge in the curve of a jaw, the tilt of a shoulder. A quiet fire that promised he had walked into something far greater than a mere inheritance. The tallest of the women stepped forward, her presence commanding without a word. "You can handle all 5 of us," she said, her voice steady, carrying a certainty that made him swallow hard. Her name, he would soon learn, was Arona, a woman whose reputation in whispered stories carried the weight of storms. She was followed by Valera, whose laughter could light up the darkest cabin corner yet hide sharpness in its undertone, and Junara, who seemed to move with the silence of the forest itself, her gaze penetrating and unreadable. Then came Brenna, a woman whose strength was measured in the way she held herself, like the mountains had carved her from stone, and last Lysel, whose calm and cunning suggested she saw truths that no one else dared speak. 5 names, 5 forces, and him, standing on the threshold, suddenly feeling smaller than the cabin itself. The wind carried whispers through the trees, almost like voices warning him to turn back. But curiosity, stubbornness, and the thrill of the unknown pushed him forward. The cabin door groaned as he opened it, stepping inside into a room lined with relics of a past he barely understood. Old photographs, journals, and hunting gear lay scattered across shelves and tables. The air was heavy with anticipation, like the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how this meeting would unfold. The women had already spread themselves across the room, each occupying a place as if claiming territory not just in the cabin, but in his life. "You've come far," Irona said again, her voice softer now, but still firm. "But distance doesn't measure strength. And strength is what you'll need if you intend to stay." Her gaze swept over him, unyielding. He could feel the weight of expectation, of tests he hadn't agreed to, but would be forced to face. The other 4 watched in silence, each radiating a different kind of power. Like 5 edges of a blade ready to strike, if he faltered, he took a breath, trying to gather himself, but the cabin seemed alive around him, groaning with age, creaking like the steps of ghosts. The fire from the old stone hearth, casting shadows that danced on the walls. The air smelled of pine, old wood, and something harder to name, something wild and untamed, like the women themselves. He wondered if he had been brave or foolish to step into this place alone. The forest outside seemed darker now, pressing against the windows like it. Tu was watching, waiting to see if he could truly handle what lay ahead. Valera tilted her head, studying him. "The woods aren't kind to strangers," she said. "And neither are we." Her words carried a promise and a warning at the same time, and he felt a flicker of unease. Junara's eyes lingered longer, assessing his movements, as if she could see every fear hiding behind his steady exterior. Brenna and Lysel exchanged a glance, silent but full of meaning. Together, the 5 of them formed an unspoken bond, a force he hadn't yet learned to navigate. He realized then that the cabin wasn't just inherited land. It was a proving ground. It had always been meant for someone capable, someone who could endure not just the wilderness, but the strength, cunning, and determination of those who claimed it now. And the women. They weren't simply residents. They were guardians, test givers, keepers of a legacy he barely understood. Each step he took inside, each glance exchanged, felt like crossing an invisible line, one he couldn't step back from. The fire snapped, sending a sharp glow over the room. Shadows twisted and stretched, and for a moment he could have sworn the cabin breathed along with him. Irona took a step closer, reducing the space between them, her eyes never leaving his. "You'll need to prove it," she said simply, the words hanging heavy in the air. "All 5 of us. Not tomorrow, not later." Now, a sudden knock at the door startled him, echoing through the cabin like a cannon. The women's eyes flicked toward it, but none moved. Irona's gaze met his, a silent question hanging between them. "Were you ready for what comes next?" He opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. His pulse quickened, and the weight of the cabin pressed in from every corner. The shadows lengthening as if the house itself was leaning closer, listening. He didn't know what awaited him outside, or even inside the walls of the place he thought he had inherited as a quiet refuge. But one thing was clear: nothing would ever be quiet again. Not with the 5 of them waiting, watching, and daring him to prove he belonged. The wind moaned through the pines once more, carrying a sense of inevitability. Outside, the forest waited, dark and endless. Inside, the cabin's hearth flickered as if urging him forward, and in the center of it all, he stood, heart pounding, knowing that the first test had already begun, though he had yet to understand its rules. A long pause stretched between them. A moment heavy with tension, and then Irona smiled, just slightly. Just enough to hint at challenge and danger both. "Do you think you can handle all 5 of us?" she asked again. And as the words settled in the room, he realized this wasn't just about endurance, courage, or strength. It was about something deeper, something that would test every part of him's mind, his will, and perhaps the very core of who he thought he was. The answer lingered on his lips. But before he could speak, a shadow moved across the threshold behind him, and the cabin seemed to shift, the air thickening. Someone was coming, and in that moment, he knew the real challenge hadn't even begun. He turned slowly, every nerve on edge, as the shadow shifted at the cabin's threshold. The fading sunlight cast it in a dark silhouette, but as it moved closer, he saw it was not one of the women. It was a man, or at least someone claiming to be. The smell of damp earth and sweat clung to him, mingling with the cabin's old pine and smoke. His boots thudded against the floorboards as he entered, eyes cautious yet calculating. There was something in his posture that screamed familiarity with the wild, a knowing of its dangers, yet his presence brought an unspoken threat. Irona's expression didn't change. She simply tilted her head, her gaze unwavering, as if she could weigh his intentions in a single glance. Valera's fingers traced the edge of the fireplace, restless, a flicker of impatience behind her calm exterior. Janara's eyes scanned the newcomer, silent, sharp, like a hawk assessing a shadow on the ground. Brenna stood taller than before, fists relaxed, but ready and lysol. Her lips curved faintly, the quietest hint of a smile that suggested she knew more than she let on. The man stopped a few paces inside the cabin and tipped his hat back, revealing a lined face with eyes that had seen the forest's cruelest secrets. "I reckon this place still remembers me," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "I'm not here to fight. Just to see if the stories about the 5 are true. Stories." The word carried weight, and he felt it pressing down on him like the cabin itself. He hadn't known there were stories about the cabin, about these women, but somehow the air seemed heavier now, thick with history and unsaid warnings. Irona stepped slightly forward. "Stories change in the telling," she said, "and some truths are never meant for strangers." The man's gaze swept over the room, lingering on him just long enough to make him uncomfortable. "I ain't no stranger," he said, his tone softening slightly. "Your family. They knew mine once. Long before the ridge swallowed us all." He glanced at the 5 women, then back to the man. Something in their silent communication suggested this revelation mattered, though he didn't understand why. Brenna's jaw tightened, and Janara's eyes darkened, hinting at memories he couldn't yet grasp. The cabin seemed to pulse with recognition, so it remembered the connection between these two worlds, and now he was caught in the middle. The man introduced himself as Kalen, a wanderer who had spent years tracing paths through the mountains, following whispers of families long lost. His presence made the forest outside feel smaller, closer, as if the shadows themselves had drawn him in for a reason. He spoke of the ridge, the old trails, and the rivers that had shaped the lives of those who had lived here before, painting a picture of hardship, resilience, and unspoken bonds that had been tested over generations. Every word carried weight, and he could sense the women absorbing every detail, their faces alternating between calm and tense. He realized then that the cabin was more than shelter or inheritance. It was a crossroads, a place where history, power, and secrets intersected, and somehow, the 5 women were guardians not only of this land but of the stories and truths it held. Each had their own reason for staying, their own connection to the ridge and the legacy it protected. Irona, he guessed, was the leader, the one who bore the burden of remembering and enforcing the old codes. Valera, the quick thinker, likely handled the delicate balance between danger and diplomacy. Janara's silence and calculated movements suggested she had witnessed more than she revealed. A keeper of vigilance and caution. Brenna's sheer presence radiated protective strength in Lysel. Lysel was the strategist, the mind that understood the unseen threads binding the past to the present. Kellen's voice shifted. More urgent now, as he revealed fragments of an old feud between families. A conflict that had been long buried but not forgotten. The ridge has its own rules, he said. Rules that even the wind can't hide. You think you've inherited just a cabin, but you've inherited responsibility. And danger. Real danger. The word sent a shiver through him. He had come seeking quiet, perhaps even adventure. But what Kalen described was something far more complex. The ridge was alive, not just with wildlife and weather, but with legacies of those who had come before. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the pines, now felt loaded with meaning. And the women, each in their silent strength, were not simply part of this inheritance. They were the living memory of it. He wanted to ask questions, to understand how he fit into this world, but the words lodged in his throat. Instead, he watched as the 5 women exchanged subtle glances, their expressions shifting imperceptibly, a language of nods, tilts, and flickers, only they fully understood. He felt like an outsider on a stage where the actors already knew their lines. Every instinct told him to step carefully, to learn before speaking. But there was also a thrill in being at the center of something so alive, so dangerous and so mysterious. Kalen moved closer to the hearth, the light catching his eyes. "I've seen what the ridge can do to those unprepared," he said, almost to himself. It changes people. It tests them. And it has a way of revealing who can endure and who can't. His gaze swept over the 5 women, and for a fleeting moment, the tension in the cabin deepened. Each woman's posture stiffened slightly, and he sensed that Kellen's words carried more than just caution. They hinted at history. Perhaps betrayal, and certainly pain. He realized that he was not merely inheriting a cabin. He was stepping into a living story, one that had roots in survival, power, and hidden alliances. The women, in their beauty and strength, were both guides and gatekeepers, teaching and testing simultaneously. And Kellen's presence was a reminder that the world outside this cabin had eyes on it, that the ridge was more than isolation. It was a battlefield of wits, courage, and endurance. Valera moved forward, her voice calm but edged with something sharper than before. "If you intend to stay, you'll need to learn the ways of the ridge, not just the trails and the rivers, but the unspoken rules that have held this land safe for generations." She gestured subtly to the maps and journals scattered around the cabin. "Knowledge is more than paper here. It's survival." Janara stepped closer, her gaze fixed on him. "And caution," she said simply. "One wrong step, one misplaced word, and this ridge will take more than your pride." Her eyes seemed to look right through him, reading the hesitations he hadn't yet admitted to himself. Brenna's presence behind her was like a shield of raw strength. "We don't do favors," she said. "We protect what's ours, and we test those who think they can handle it. You'll see soon enough if you belong." Lysel, standing apart, let a quiet smile form on her lips. "Belonging isn't about inheritance or blood," she said. "It's about endurance, understanding, and knowing when to act. The ridge watches. It remembers. And so do we." He swallowed hard, the firelight flickering across the cabin walls, casting shadows that moved like figures from the past. Everything in this place, the women, the man at the door, the smell of the forest, the creaking floorboards, was a piece of a puzzle he hadn't yet learned to solve. And in that moment, he knew the real challenge was not just surviving the ridge or understanding its secrets. It was proving himself worthy to those who already knew the stakes. Kalen straightened, his gaze lingering on him for a long moment. "The cabin chooses who it keeps," he said finally, "and it doesn't forgive weakness." Step back toward the door, leaving behind a silence that was heavy with threat and promise. The 5 women's eyes followed him as he left, then turned their focus back to him. He felt the weight of their scrutiny, the subtle power dynamics in play, and the unspoken test that had already begun. The cabin seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if it were a living thing judging him, weighing his worth against a legacy he had barely begun to understand. The wind outside rustled the pines, carrying the promise of storms to come, and he realized that the ridge held more than history, and challenge it held secrets that could change him. The women, and perhaps even the world beyond the forest. Every step he took inside the cabin now mattered. Every glance, every decision, every moment of hesitation or courage was part of a test he didn't yet fully grasp, and as the fire crackled and shadows danced across the walls, he knew one truth with certainty: the story of this ridge, the cabin, and the 5 women was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning, and he was at the center of a tale where survival, trust, strength would be measured in ways he had never imagined. The first trials had been set, the players were revealed, and the ridge waited patiently, watching. Knowing that every choice could be the difference between belonging and being lost forever, he woke before dawn, the chill of the ridge pressing through the thin cabin walls. The forest outside was a black ocean of pines and shadows, the wind whispering secrets he could almost hear but not fully understand. He sat on the edge of the bed, listening, waiting, and wondering how he had walked so willingly into a place that felt alive with danger. The women were already moving. He could hear Irana's boots on the wooden floor, steady and purposeful, Valera humming softly to herself as she tended to the hearth, and Janara sliding a knife along the counter, testing its edge. Brenna's heavy stride carried across the cabin as she arranged firewood, while Lysel lingered near the window, her eyes fixed on the distant peaks as if reading a message in the morning mist. Each woman moved with certainty, every motion deliberate, and he realized their strength was not just physical, it was a rhythm, a language, and a rule that he hadn't learned yet. He dressed quickly, trying to keep quiet, but the cabin seemed to notice him, creaking under his weight, testing him with each hesitant step. Outside, the wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine needles, mingling with the faint trace of smoke from the hearth. It was beautiful, but it reminded him that this was not just a cabin. It was a proving ground. Irana turned when he stepped into the main room, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "The ridge doesn't wait," she said simply. "It doesn't forgive hesitation. And neither do we." Her words hung heavy in the air, pressing down on him, yet beneath them was an invitation, a challenge he couldn't refuse. Valera glanced at him, her expression softer, almost teasing. But there was an edge that told him every smile could mask danger. Janara's eyes never left him, silent and observing, as if measuring the parts of him he didn't yet know existed. Brenna spoke next, her voice deep and firm. "You'll need to understand the rules before the ridge tests you in ways you can't imagine. The forest is not kind to those who step in blindly." Lysel's calm voice followed, softer but just as weighted. "And the rules aren't written. They are learned, through observation, endurance, and knowing when to act." He nodded, feeling the enormity of what lay ahead. He wanted to ask questions, but the words seemed small against the weight of the ridge, the cabin, and the women. Instead, he followed them outside, where the frost of early morning clung to every branch, and the ridge stretched endlessly into mist and shadow. The first trial was not spoken of in words. It was in the cold air, the uneven ground, the way the wind shifted unexpectedly, and how every step could be the difference between balance and a fall. Irana led the way, moving as though the path was hers alone. He struggled to match her stride, every muscle aching from the climb. And he realized quickly that endurance alone would not be enough. Valera fell into step beside him, speaking softly about the flora and the signs of wildlife. Each observation layered with warnings he had to decode. Junara circled behind them, silent, making sure nothing followed, nothing threatened them from the shadows of the pines. Brenna carried their packs, her strength almost inhuman, while Lizelle watched from above, noting details he could not see, her mind mapping the ridge with precision by midday. They reached a rocky ledge overlooking a valley shrouded in mist. The drop was steep, almost vertical in places, and the wind howled through the gap like a living thing. He stared over the edge, feeling the pull of gravity, the fear of heights, and something deeper, a sense that the ridge demanded more than courage. It demanded clarity, focus, and trust. Irana's gaze met his. "Fear is natural," she said, "but hesitation will kill you here. You need to move with purpose, not panic." He took a step forward, then another, and the ridge seemed to test him, the rocks unstable underfoot. Valera's hand brushed against his arm, a silent reassurance, yet the pressure of expectation weighed heavily. Junara moved like a shadow, guiding him when the path shifted beneath him.
Oh, wow.
While Brenna's voice carried warnings over the wind, precise and deliberate. Lysel's eyes caught every detail from the summit. Her calm observation, a map he could not yet read but could feel in his bones as the day wore on. He began to understand that the ridge was not just a physical challenge, it was a mental and emotional one. He had inherited the cabin, yes, but he had also inherited the stories, the histories, and the conflicts tied to the land. Each of the women represented a different facet of that inheritance: strength, intelligence, caution, strategy, and guidance. They tested him not only in endurance, but in perception, forcing him to observe, anticipate, and adapt. Back at the cabin, the atmosphere thickened with tension. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Irana sat at the table, tracing the lines of an old map with her fingers, while Valera cleaned tools with meticulous care. Junara sharpened a blade, each stroke deliberate and quiet. Brenna leaned against the doorway, alert, and Lysel studied the patterns of the wind through the open window. He watched them, realizing that their calm exteriors hid a network of alliances, unspoken rules, and shared histories that he could barely grasp. Kalen returned at dusk, his presence adding a new layer of tension. He carried news of travelers on the ridge, rumors of disputes between other families, and warnings that danger was approaching. The women's reactions were subtle but telling: a flick of an eye, a tightening of a jaw, a quiet nod. The cabin had become a hub of vigilance, and he was in the center, learning not only the terrain, but the delicate dynamics of trust and caution. Night fell, and the forest beyond the cabin grew darker, more menacing. The wind whispered through the trees like voices of the past, reminding him that the ridge had its own rules and its own memory. Every sound, the snapping of a branch, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified, a signal of the challenges yet to come. The women moved with purpose, checking doors, securing windows, and preparing for whatever the night might bring. Their beauty was undeniable, but it was their strength, their precision, and their vigilance that held him captive. As he lay in the small guest room, sleep evading him, he thought about the trials ahead. The ridge demanded endurance, insight, and courage. The cabin demanded respect and understanding. And the women, Rana, Valera, Junara, Brenna, and Lysel, demanded attention, observation, and a willingness to be tested. Every lesson, every glance, every movement carried meaning he had yet to fully grasp. Outside, Shadow moved across the ridge, unseen but sensed. A distant howl carried through the trees, and the wind shifted suddenly, as if signaling that the first true test was approaching. The cabin's walls seemed to lean closer. The fire flickered with urgency. And he knew that the night would bring revelations, confrontations, and challenges that could not be anticipated. Kellen's warning, the women's silent instructions, and the ridge itself coalesced into a force that pressed upon him, relentless and exacting. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Irona's eyes caught his in the dim firelight, conveying the unspoken understanding that the ridge's challenges were only beginning. Valera's quiet hum had stopped, her attention fixed outside. Junara's hand rested on the hilt of her blade, ready but restrained. Brenna's stance was protective, her gaze scanning every shadow. Lysel's calm was like a tether, grounding the group even as the air thickened with anticipation. And he knew, lying awake, that nothing in the ridge, the cabin, or the women's vigilance was accidental. Every test, every warning, every silent message was part of a larger conflict he had yet to fully understand. The inheritance of the cabin was not merely property, it was a crucible, and he was now at its center, tested by history, by the women, and by the living. Breathing challenge of the ridge itself, sleep came only in brief fragments, interrupted by whispers of wind, distant sounds of movement, and the constant reminder that he had stepped into a story far larger than himself. By dawn, he would rise again to face new trials, each shaped by the cabin, the women, and the secrets of the land. And though he did not yet know the full scope of the conflict, one truth was clear: the ridge would not be conquered, the cabin would not yield, and the women would not relent. He was caught in a web of history, endurance, and unseen forces. And the path forward was shrouded in mist, danger, and the promise of tests he could barely imagine. The wind had turned sharp, slicing through the ridge like a knife, carrying the scent of snow and pine resin. He stood at the edge of the cabin's porch, gripping the railing, staring into the shadows of the forest that seemed darker than ever. The ridge had grown restless, as if aware of the tension brewing inside the cabin. The women were already awake, moving with precision that made him feel clumsy and uncertain. Irana checked the locks on the doors with practiced ease, her eyes scanning the tree line as though expecting trouble to step out of the shadows. Valera was arranging firewood, humming low, but he noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped each piece as if testing its weight. Junara lingered near the window, her sharp gaze piercing through the fog. Reading the forest in ways he couldn't yet understand, Brenna carried heavy packs down the steps with ease, the muscles in her arms flexing with a rhythm that seemed both natural and intimidating. Lysel stood a step back from the group, her calm presence a quiet anchor, but her eyes flickered with calculation. Taking in every motion and sound, he realized then that the ridge demanded more than endurance. It demanded awareness, focus, and trust. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves felt amplified. The forest seemed alive, watching, waiting for the first mistake. Kellen's warning from days before echoed in his mind. The cabin chooses who it keeps, and the ridge does not forgive weakness. Today will test you in ways you cannot yet see, Irana said, her voice carrying over the morning wind. The ridge will push you, the forest will challenge you, and we will judge you. There was no malice in her tone, only certainty. Valera stepped closer and added softly, "The tests are not just of strength. They are of mind, heart, and will." The morning light filtered through the pine needles, casting dappled patterns on the ground. He followed the 5 women as they led him toward the upper ridges. Paths narrow and treacherous, the mist thickening with each step. Junara moved behind him, her hand hovering near the hilt of her knife, ready to intervene if danger appeared. Brenna carried the heavier loads, yet her eyes never left the path, anticipating every loose stone, every sudden drop. Lysel's voice cut through the quiet, noting patterns in the wind, signs in the birds, and movements of the forest animals that hinted at unseen threats. Hours passed, and the ridge tested them at every turn. Loose stones tumbled underfoot, roots threatened to trip him, and the wind carried sounds that set his nerves on edge. The women moved like extensions of the ridge itself, their confidence a constant reminder of his inexperience. Each challenged the climb, the river crossing. The sudden drop was a puzzle he had to solve, not only with skill, but with observation. One wrong decision could lead to injury or worse. They finally paused on a narrow plateau, the valley stretching below like a living map of shadow and mist. Irana turned to him, her eyes steady. "You are learning, but the ridge has more to reveal. Your strength alone will not be enough," Valera added. "You will see the truth of it soon, and it will not be gentle." The forest seemed to lean in closer as if listening. A distant howl broke the silence, and the wind carried it to them, sharp and unrelenting. Janara's hand went to her knife instinctively, and Brenna's stance shifted, a silent warning. Lysel's eyes narrowed, analyzing, reading the ridge in ways he could not yet understand. The tension was suffocating, and he felt the weight of every step, every breath, every moment of hesitation. Kalen appeared at the edge of the plateau, as if materializing from the mist itself. His presence brought a new wave of tension. "They're not the only ones who know these paths," he said, his voice low but carrying through the cold air. "There are others, eyes on the ridge that watch, and they will test you as well." The women exchanged a series of quick glances, subtle movements that spoke volumes. Irona's jaw tightened, and Valera's hum had ceased completely. Janara's eyes sharpened, Brenna's grip tightened on her pack. Lysel's calm was a mask over careful calculation. He felt the enormity of it. The ridge, the cabin, the women, Cal and all, were part of a larger puzzle, a network of challenges and hidden forces that he had stepped into without understanding. Every instinct screamed caution. Every nerve begged him to pause, yet moving back was not an option. The tests were inevitable, the ridge unyielding, and the women unwavering in their watch as they descended toward a narrow gorge. The mist thickened, and the wind carried whispers, almost like voices from the forest. He stumbled, nearly losing balance on a slick rock, and Janara's hand steadied him. "You must move with purpose," she said quietly, her eyes locked on his. "The ridge does not forgive hesitation." Brenna followed immediately, reinforcing the warning with her presence, making it clear that mistakes would be costly. Valera spoke then, her voice barely above the wind. "Every choice matters. Every misstep echoes beyond the ridge. Remember that." Her words, calm yet sharp, sank into him. He realized that the ridge was more than physical challenge. It was a test of awareness, decision-making, and trust in the land and the women, and increasingly, in himself. They reached a narrow bridge of logs stretched across the gorge, the wind pressing against him from both sides. Irona stepped first, her balance flawless, moving with the certainty of someone who had known these paths all her life. One by one, the others followed, until only he remained. The weight of the moment pressed down, and he felt a sharp edge of fear and anticipation. Kellen's gaze on him was steady, knowing, almost judging. He took a deep breath, remembering the lessons of the past days, the way the ridge tested not just strength, but perception, endurance, and focus. He stepped forward, one foot on the log, the other following, every muscle tense. The wind howled, tugging at his balance, threatening to throw him into the gorge below. Janara's hand hovered nearby, ready, and Brenna's presence loomed like a shield. Valera's voice carried faint encouragement, and Lysel's eyes measured each move with quiet precision. Halfway across, a branch snapped above him, sending a cascade of needles and small stones down the gorge. He stumbled, heart racing, and felt the full weight of the ridge's challenge. Irona's hand reached out, steadying him, and for a moment, the world narrowed to a single point: the log beneath his feet, the wind in his ears, the steady support of the women around him. When he reached the other side, his legs trembling, he realized the ridge had not just tested his body, but his mind, his focus, and his will. The plateau beyond offered a brief reprieve, but the sense of danger lingered, coiling like smoke through the trees. Kellen's presence remained a reminder that more eyes watched. More tests awaited, and the forest was far from tamed. By evening, they returned to the cabin, the shadows long. and the tension heavier than before. Irona's expression was unreadable, Valera's movements precise, Janara's gaze distant, Brenna's body alert, and Lascelles' calm unwavering. He felt exhausted, but the trials had only sharpened his awareness. He understood that the ridge, the cabin, and the women had formed a crucible to test him in every way physically. Mentally and emotionally, the fire burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. Kalen spoke again, his voice low, carrying weight. "Tomorrow brings the hardest test yet," he said. "The ridge demands more than endurance now. It demands understanding, courage, and unity." Rona looked at him, her eyes piercing. "You've come far," she said. "But the true challenge is only beginning. The ridge will not forgive mistakes. And neither will we," Valera added softly. "Trust what you've learned. But know that trust alone will not carry you through." Janara's hand rested on her knife. A silent warning, Brenna's stance radiated readiness, and like Cell's calm was the thread holding them together. The cabin seemed to pulse with anticipation, the wind outside carrying the promise of storms, both literal and metaphorical. Every shadow, every sound, every flicker of light felt charged with meaning. He lay awake that night, heart pounding, aware of the ridge, the cabin, the women, and the unseen eyes watching from the forest. Tomorrow, he knew, the tests would escalate. The challenges of endurance, perception, trust, and courage would collide, and the stakes had never been higher. The ridge was alive, the cabin was sentient, and the women were forces he could barely comprehend. And in that fragile, tense space between night and dawn, he understood one undeniable truth: the climax of his trials was coming. And nothing would be the same once it began. The ridge waited. The cabin held its breath, and the 5 women watched him, ready to push, test, and reveal the final truths that would determine his place in the legacy he had inherited. The sun rose slowly over Thee, spilling gold across the peaks and valleys, softening the harshness of the past days. He stepped onto the porch of the cabin, feeling the weight of exhaustion and triumph in equal measure. The forest was quiet now, alive but patient. And he understood for the first time that the ridge had not been punishing him. The wind carried a softer note today, a quiet approval. The cabin seemed to hum with the peace of resolved tension. Irona appeared at his side, her expression softer than he had ever seen. "You endured," she said, her voice steady, but in it lay a warmth that had been absent before. "The ridge tests all who come here, and few leave with their mind and spirit intact. You've done both." Valera stepped forward, carrying a basket of herbs and freshly gathered wood, her smile small but genuine. "You've watched, listened, and moved carefully. That is how you belong here." Janara emerged from the shadow of the cabin, her gaze piercing but lighter than before. She nodded toward him, a silent acknowledgement of his growth. "You have learned what the ridge asks of us. Strength without awareness, courage without understanding, it would have cost you." Brenna followed, adjusting a strap on her pack, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "You faced every challenge and learned to trust yourself and us. That is enough." Lascelles remained a step back, her calm presence like the steady pulse of the forest itself. "The cabin, the ridge, the women, you've become part of the balance here," she said. "It is no small thing to learn where one belongs and how to move with the forces around you." He breathed deeply, taking in the crisp mountain air, feeling it fill his lungs, clearing the tension that had built inside him. The ridge had been a teacher, the cabin a test, and the 5 women had been both guides and guardians. Each of them had challenged him in a way only they could. And now, in the soft light of morning, he understood the depth of what he had inherited. It was not land or wood or stone, it was history, wisdom, responsibility. Kalen appeared at the edge of the porch, his expression unreadable at first, then breaking into a faint smile. "You've done what many could not," he said. "The ridge respects those who learn its ways, who understand its rules, and who endure its tests. You are one of them now." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The cabin has chosen well." He felt a sense of belonging that he had never expected. The women moved around him, not as opponents or examiners, but as companions and allies. Irona placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. The ridge is still wild, the forest still unpredictable. But you've learned to face it with understanding, not just brute strength. That makes all the difference. Valera laughed softly, a sound that carried through the morning air and lifted some of the heaviness he had carried. And now, you can rest, at least for a while, she said. Junara gave a small, rare smile. Brenna's stance relaxed, and even Lysel's calm seemed lighter, the tension of watchfulness easing. Together, they stepped into the cabin, moving with the rhythm they had always shared, welcoming him into their world. The rooms that had once seemed mysterious and unwelcoming now felt like home. Every detail, the worn floors, the smell of pine, the scattered journals and tools held new meaning. He could see the legacy in every corner, the history of the ridge in every shadow, the strength of the women in every glance. That afternoon, they gathered around the hearth, sharing stories of the ridge, of past trials, of ancestors who had walked the paths before them. He listened, contributing his own observations and experiences, and found that the cabin, the ridge, and the women had changed him in ways he could barely describe. He was stronger, more aware, and more connected to a world that demanded respect and courage in equal measure. Irana spoke then, her voice carrying the weight of reflection. Every challenge, every test, every moment of fear or doubt, it was meant to prepare you, not just for the ridge, but for life here, for understanding what it means to belong and endure. Valera added, the lessons you've learned are yours now. Use them wisely, move with care, and the ridge will support you rather than test you. Janara's sharp eyes softened as she said, you've faced the unknown and proven that you can adapt. That is rare. That is strength. Brenna nodded in agreement, and it will be tested again, yes. But now you know the rhythm, the rules, the ways of balance. You're ready? Lysel leaned back slightly, her calm certainty grounding the room. Remember that belonging is more than endurance. It is respect, awareness, and understanding. You carry all of it now if you choose to honor it. Even Kalen, watching from the doorway, seemed satisfied. The ridge had tested him, the cabin had observed him, and the women had guided him. And in the quiet aftermath of tension, he realized the story of survival, courage, and growth had reached a natural pause, not an end. The challenges had shaped him, but the ridge, the cabin, and the women had also welcomed him, revealing the balance between risk and trust. Strength and wisdom, as the evening descended. They moved outside, watching the sun sink behind the peaks, painting the sky with hues of gold, orange, and crimson. The forest and ridge seemed at peace, the wind gentle, the distant sound of birds carrying the promise of life continuing in its rhythm. The cabin's walls held warmth and history, its doors open to the lessons of the past and the possibilities of the future. He stood among the women, feeling a quiet gratitude and a deep respect. Irana's gaze met his, and in it he saw approval tempered with care. Valera's laughter carried lightly on the wind. Junara's calm presence reassured him. Brenna's strength comforted, and Lysel's wisdom grounded him. The legacy he had inherited was no longer a burden. It was a gift. Kalen nodded once more before turning back toward the ridge, leaving them to their peace. The tension of past days remained in memory, a reminder of the ridge's challenges, but the fear had lifted. He had faced it, endured, learned, and belonged. The cabin, the forest, and the women had accepted him, not as an intruder, but as part of their story. As night fell, the stars appeared, scattered across the sky like a map of possibilities. The ridge was quiet, the cabin warm, and the 5 women close, sharing quiet smiles and unspoken trust. He understood now that life here would still hold challenges, but he also knew he had the skill, the awareness, and the courage to meet them. He walked to the edge of the porch one last time that night. Feeling the wind against his face, the scent of pine and snow in the air, the ridge stretched endlessly, mysterious and powerful, yet no longer threatening. It was alive, yes, but it had taught him to respect, endure, and belong. The cabin was more than shelter. It was a home, a history, and a symbol of resilience. And the 5 women, Rona, Valera, Renar, Brenna, and Lysel, had become companions, teachers, and friends. Guiding him through a journey he would never forget, he turned back toward the cabin, taking in the warmth of the firelight spilling through the windows, the quiet hum of life within, and the sense of belonging he had earned. The ridge, the cabin, and the women had tested him, challenged him, and shaped him, but they had also welcomed him into a world of strength, courage, and trust. As he stepped inside, the cabin seemed to sigh in quiet approval, the fire casting a gentle glow across the walls. And for the first time, he felt truly at home. The wind outside whispered through the pines, carrying the soft echo of past lessons and the quiet promise of future days. The ridge, the cabin, and the 5 women had given him not only challenge, but guidance, not only tension, but belonging, and not only trials, but hope. And in that quiet, perfect moment, he realized the true lesson of the ridge and the cabin. Strength is measured not just by endurance, but by understanding, courage, and the ability to belong. The challenges had ended, but the story of life here, of learning, growing, and living with purpose, had only just begun. The cabin's warmth, the forest's rhythm, and the 5 women's watchful guidance promised that the future held more trials. Yes, but also more triumphs, laughter, and quiet moments of peace. He smiled, feeling the weight of the past lifted and the hope of tomorrow settling firmly on his shoulders. The ridge would always be wild, the forest unpredictable, and the cabin alive with history. But he was ready. And for the first time, he truly understood what it meant when Irana had said, "You can handle all 5 of us." He had not only handled them, he had become part of their world, part of the cabin, and part of the enduring legacy of the ridge. And as the night settled over the peaks, the fire glowed warmly, and the wind whispered softly through the trees. The cabin held them all in quiet harmony, a place of challenge met and lessons learned, where belonging and courage had won the day, and where the story would continue, strong and enduring, for